Hi, my name is Mackenzie Messamore. The title of the passage that I think should be a movie is The Pit and the Pendulum by Edgar Allan Poe. It would fit under the genre thriller and suspense. So the story starts, and it is told in the perspective of Poe himself. He is lying on the cold floor in pain and agony. He struggles to move or even open his eyes. When he finally gathers enough energy to pry open his heavy eyelids, he sees that he is surrounded by nothing but darkness. Left only with his thoughts, he struggles to his feet to try to feel his way around the unknown area. He eventually finds a wall that he suspects to be made of stone. It is at that moment that he realizes that he is in a prison cell, and memories start to flood back. Memories of the trial, of the framing, it all swept through his soul unlike anything he's ever experienced before. This sudden burst of remembrance angered him. He continued around the perimeter of the cell, trying to figure out the exact shape and size of it. Without vision, this was very difficult. After he assumed he had finished measuring the room, he guessed the size to be 50 feet by 20 feet. It wasn't a moment later that he tripped on something and face-planted onto the floor. But he didn't hit his face. Only his body and chin had made an impact on the floor, and his head was dangling down into empty space. He then realized he had almost fallen into an abyss of death. He stood up, brushed himself off, and proceeded in the opposite direction of the pit to lay back down where he had started. He figured sleep would take his mind off of these things, these bad things. So in this next scene, he awakens, and he can actually see. He looks around and realizes his cell measurements were way off, and the walls were made of iron, not stone. He then spots some water and some meat on the floor of the cell for him. He then remembers how hungry he was, so he sat down to binge on the food. It must have been drugged, because he starts to feel dizzy and he passes out. He awakes again, but this time he's strapped to a stone platform in the cell. Rats are crawling all over him, so he squirmed until they eventually scurried off. He hated being tied down. In him lying on the stone-cold platform, he noticed something peculiar. There was a pendulum hanging from the ceiling in the far distance. He watched as the pendulum slowly swung back and forth and back and forth. This consumed all of his thought. After a while, he noticed that the pendulum was getting closer and closer to him, and that it had a large blade on the end. He started to freak out because he knew that this would be the way he would die. He couldn't escape it, so he had to try and figure out a way to free himself. The pendulum was no more than 5 feet above his body, and he realized it was going to cut right where one of the ropes was tied. He waited in agony as the blade got close to his body. It swung once, and the rope was halfway off. It swung again, and he felt a searing pain. The rope was off, but it had cut him a little. He didn't care. He dove up the platform and landed on the floor right in the nick of time before the pendulum swung and hit the stone right where he was laying. Apparently he was being watched, because not a moment later the walls began to glow. He went up to a wall and touched it and pulled back his hand away as quick as he could because it just had burned his fingers. He started to see the walls close in on him, all in the direction of the pit. He couldn't stay against the walls or he would get burned, and he couldn't walk to the middle because he would fall into the abyss. He had no choice but to wait until there was no room left to stand and fall into the pit. This was it, the end of his life. Just as he wasn't able to stand on the floor no longer, he heard trumpets and the walls expanded back to their original position. Out of shock, he fainted into the abyss. But before he fell completely in, an arm reached out and grabbed him.